Isn't it 31? How's everybody doing today? Sorry I'm late. I know I'm late. I don't know how many minutes I'm late, but I'm late. Um, it is Saturday and I got all my meat and vegetables and everything in the crock pot, but the meat was raw, so I wanted it to cook. And I just had to go and put the sauce in. We're having spaghetti. Of course, we're having spaghetti. It's Friday. All right. Hello, hello. Marie Dunn, Angie Mack. Let's put me on top chat. And now I like to remind you that this book is a total work of fiction based on Laura Ingalls' memories of things that her parents talked about of what happened in. Maybe she might have had a few memories of her own, but the truth is, when they were in Indian territory, she was only like 18 months old, right? So, I gotta change my glasses. So are we ready? Chapter 14, Indian Camp. Hey, Alexis. Okay. Hi, Pam. All right, I can't read the chat because I'm wearing the wrong glasses. Hey, Tamasu, Aldo, Angie Mack. Oh, it's nice to see everybody turning up. All right, here we go. Indian Camp. All right. Day after day was hotter than the day before. The wind was hot, as if it came out of an oven, Ma said. The grass was turning yellow. The whole world was rippling green and gold under the blazing sky. At noon, the wind died down. No birds sang. Everything was so still that Laura could hear the squirrels chattering in the trees down by the creek. Suddenly, black crows flew overhead, cawing their rough, sharp caws. Then everything was still again. Maybe my eyes do need changing. Oh, that'll work. Ma said that this was midsummer. Pa wondered where the Indians had gone. He said they had left their little camp on the prairie, and one day he asked Laura and Mary if they would like to see that camp. It's so far, Charles, she said, and in this heat. Pa's blue eyes twinkled. The heat doesn't hurt the Indians, and it won't hurt us, he said. Come on, girls. Please, can Jack come too? Laura begged. Pa had taken his gun, but he looked at Laura, and he looked at Jack, and he looked at Ma, and he put the gun up on its pegs again. All right, Laura. I'll take Jack, Caroline, and leave you the gun. Jack jumped around them, wagging his stump of a tail. As soon as he saw which way they were going, he set off, trotting ahead. Pa came next, and behind him, Mary, and then Laura. Mary kept her sunbonnet on, but Laura's let hers dangle down her back, as would I. The ground was hot under their bare feet. The sunshine pierced through their faded dresses and tingled on their arms and backs. The air was really as hot as the air in an oven, and it smelled faintly like baking bread. Pa said the smell came from all the grass seeds parching in the heat. They went further and further into the vast prairie. Laura felt smaller and smaller. Even Pa did not seem as big as he really was. At last they went down into the little hollow where the Indians had camped. Jack started up a big rabbit. When he bounded out of the grass, Laura jumped. Pa said quickly, "Let him go, Jack. We have meat enough." So Jack sat down and watched the big rabbit go bounding away down the hollow. Remember, Jack doesn't actually exist, right? So, Laura and Mary looked around them. They stayed close to Pa. Low bushes grew on the sides of the hollow. Buckbrush with sprays of berries faintly pink, and sumac holding up green cones but showing here and there a bright red leaf. The goldenrod's plumes were turning gray, and the ox-eyed daisies' yellow petals hung down from the crown centers. All this was hidden in the secret little hollow. From the house, Laura had seen nothing but grasses, and now from this hollow she could not see the house. The prairie seemed to be level, but it was not level. Laura asked Pa if there were lots of hollows on the prairie like this one. He said there were. Are Indians in them? She almost whispered. He said he didn't know. There might be. She held tight to his hand, and Mary held to his other hand, and they looked at the Indians' camp. There were ashes where the campfires had been. There were holes in the ground where tent poles had been driven. Bones were scattered where Indian dogs had gnawed them. All along the sides of the hollow, Indian ponies had bitten the grass short. Tracks of big moccasins and smaller moccasins were everywhere, and tracks of little bare toes. And over these tracks were tracks of rabbits and tracks of birds and wolf tracks. Pa read the tracks for Mary and Laura. He showed them the tracks of two middle-sized moccasins by the edge of a campfire's ashes. An Indian woman had squatted there. She wore a leather skirt with fringes. The tiny marks of the fringe were in the dust. The track of her dress inside the moccasins was deeper than the track of her heels, because she had leaned forward to stir something cooking in a pot on the fire. Then Pa picked up a smoke-blackened forked stick, and he said that the pot had hung from a stick laid across the top of two upright forked sticks. He showed Mary and Laura the holes where the forked sticks had been driven into the ground. Then he told them to look at the bones around the camp and fire and tell them what they had cooked for supper. They looked and they said, "Rabbit." That was right. The bones were rabbit bones. Suddenly Laura shouted, "Look, look!" Something bright blue glittered in the dust. She picked it up. It was a beautiful blue bead. Laura shouted with joy. Then Mary saw a red bead, and Laura saw a green one, and they forgot everything but beads. Pa helped them to look. They found white beads and brown beads and more red and blue beads. All that afternoon they hunted for beads in the dust of the Indian camp. Now and then, Pa walked up to the edge of the hollow and looked toward home. Then he came back and helped to hunt for more beads. They looked all the ground over carefully. When they could find no more, it was almost sunset. Laura had a handful of beads, and so did Mary. Pa tied them carefully in his handkerchief. Laura's beads in one corner and Mary's in another. He put the handkerchief in his pocket, and they started home. The sun was low behind their backs when they came out of the hollow. Home was small and very far away, and Pa did not have his gun. Pa walked so swiftly that Laura could hardly keep up. She trotted as fast as she could, but the sun sank faster. Home seemed farther and farther away. The prairie seemed larger, and a wind ran over it, whispering something frightening. All the grasses shook as if they were scared. Pa turned around, and his blue eyes twinkled at Laura. He said, "Getting tired, little half-pint? It's a long way for little legs." He picked her up, big girl that she was, and he settled her safe against his shoulder. He took Mary by the hand, and so they all came home together. Supper was cooking on the fire. Ma was setting the table, and baby Carrie played with little pieces of wood on the floor. Pa tossed the handkerchief to Ma. "I'm later than I meant, Caroline," he said. "But look what the girls found." He took the milk bucket and went quickly to bring Pet and Patty from their picket lines to milk the cow. Ma untied the handkerchief and exclaimed at what she found. The beads were even prettier than they had been in the Indian camp. Laura stirred her beads with her finger and watched them sparkle and shine. "These are mine," she said. Then Mary said, "Carrie can have mine." Don't you just want to punch her? I'm sorry. I'm not that, Mary worked really hard at being the perfect little girl. Ma waited to hear what Laura would say. Laura didn't want to say anything. She wanted to keep those pretty beads. Her chest felt all hot inside, and she wished with all her might that Mary wouldn't always be such a good little girl. But she couldn't let Mary be better than she was. So she said slowly, "Carrie can have mine too." "That's my unselfish, good little girl," said Ma. "Seriously, what's Carrie going to do with beads? She's an infant, right?" She poured Mary's beads into Mary's hands and Laura's into Laura's hands, and she said she would give them a thread to string them on. The beads would make a pretty necklace for Carrie to wear around her neck. "Hey, Patricia, how's it going?" Mary and Laura sat side by side on their bed, and they strung those pretty beads on the thread that Ma gave them. Each wet her end of the thread in her mouth and twisted it tightly. Then Mary put the end of the thread through the small hole in each of the beads, and Laura put her end through the beads one by one. They didn't say anything. Perhaps Mary felt sweet and good inside, but Laura didn't. When she looked at Mary, she wanted to slap her. So she dared not look at Mary again. The beads made a beautiful string. Carrie clapped her hands and laughed when she saw it. Then Ma tied it around Carrie's little neck, and it glittered there. Laura felt a little bit better. Excuse me. After all, her beads were not enough beads to make a whole string, and neither were Mary's, but together they made a whole string of beads for Carrie. When Carrie felt the beads on her neck, she grabbed at them. She was so little that she did not know any better than to break the string. So Ma untied it, and she put the beads away until Carrie should be old enough to wear them. And often after that, Laura thought of those pretty beads, and she was still naughty enough to want her beads for herself. I don't think that's naughty, do you? But it had been a wonderful day. She could always think about the long walk across the prairie and about how they had all seen. Excuse me, I thought this was on Do Not Disturb, and it's not, so I'm going to put it on Do Not Disturb. Okay? That way we won't have any interruptions. I don't think she was naughty for wanting to keep the beads. But it had been a wonderful day. She could always think of that long that long walk across the. I am slightly dyslexic, sorry. Breath break. She could always think about that long walk across the prairie and about all they had seen in the Indian camp. Now, I'm going to research how to say this next word because I have been told that I pronounce it wrong. So let's just see. Ague. Okay. So, we know that it's all fiction anyway, right? It's all fiction anyway. But you read right Laura's feelings because she's the one who wrote this, right? So even if it's fiction, she admits that Mary ticked her off beyond measure with her holier-than-thou attitude, as we would call it today, right? So do we want to read fever and ague? I always thought it was ague or ague, but it's fever and ague. Do we want to read that? Hey, how's it going? Or do you want to quit? Okay. All righty then. Chapter 15, Fever and Ague. Now blackberries were ripe, and in the hot afternoons Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big black juicy berries hung in thick briar patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of trees and some were in the sun. But the sun was so hot that Mary and Ma stayed in the shade. There were plenty of berries. Deer lay in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and scolded because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. Wherever they went among the scratchy briars, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice, but they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat blackberries. I've seen wasps do that, but I've never seen mosquitoes do that. So, Laura's fingers and her mouth were purple-black with berry juice. Her face and her hands and her bare feet were covered with briar scratches and mosquito bites. And they were spattered with purple stains too, where she had slapped at the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails full of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted. Oh man, I'd like to see their outhouse. And next winter they would have dried blackberries to stew. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in house to mind baby Carrie because she was older. In the daytime, there were only 1 or 2 mosquitoes in the house, but at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, the mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and the stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away, but a good many mosquitoes came anyway. Pa could not play the fiddle in the evenings because so many mosquitoes bit him. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick in the bottoms. At night, Pet and Patty and the colt and the calf and the cow were stamping and swishing their tails in the stable. And in the morning, Laura's fair forehead was speckled with mosquito bites. This won't last long, Pa said. Fall's not far away, and the first cold will soon settle them. Laura did not feel very well. One day she felt cold even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Mary didn't exactly know. She said, "I just ache. My legs ache." Sorry. Laura didn't exactly know. She said, "I just ache. My legs ache." "I ache too," said Mary. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy enough, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled up Laura's skirt and petticoats to see where her legs ached. You remember snake bites, eh? You check for stuff like that. And suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold. Your face is as hot as fire." Excuse me? How did she know? How did she not know that if that child's face was as hot as fire while she's sitting in the house, she had a fever, right? Every mother knows that. But then again, this is fiction. Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cried. "I'm hot now," she said, "and my back aches." Ma called Pa, and he came in. "Charles, do look at the girls," she said. "I do believe they're sick." That just shows you how often they weren't sick, though, too, right? "Well, I don't feel any too well myself," said Pa. "First I'm hot, and then I'm cold, and I ache all over. Is that the way you feel, girls? Do your very bones ache?" Mary and Laura said that was the way they felt. Then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, "The place for you girls is in bed." It was so queer to be put in bed in the daytime, and Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held on to Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. "You will be all right. Don't worry," Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed, and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with cool, soft hand and said, "There now, go to sleep." Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up for a long, long time. Strange. Now you can tell, I'm sorry for interrupting, but you can tell from this that Laura actually suffered some kind of malarial attack at some point in her life, because she did wrote this really well. She didn't really wake up for a long, long time. She didn't go to sleep, but she didn't exactly really wake up for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night, and then suddenly sunshine would hurt her eyes, and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was tinier than the tiniest thing, then slowly it swelled, and it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster, then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could hear. There were no words, only voices. Mary was hot in the bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. Then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth till she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked the covers in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, "Go to bed, Caroline." Ma said, "You're sicker than I am, Charles." Laura opened her eyes and saw the bright sunshine. Mary was sobbing. "I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water." She said it 4 times, so I'm not going to repeat it again. Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeve in his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted up a little, and he said, "I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls." Then his head fell back and he lay still. Jack lifted his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the big bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, "Laura, can you?" "Yes, Ma," Laura said. And this time, because if you think about it, Mom fell ill after them. So while she may have gathered some strength from being in bed, Ma was going through the worst of it, right? Doesn't the timeline kind of make sense? "Yes, Ma," she said. This time she got out of bed, but when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined. But he stood still and firm when she took hold of him and sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little water in it. She shook so with cold that she could hardly get hold of the dipper, but she did get hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she set out across that enormous floor again. Jack stayed by her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held onto the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. Then she stopped crying. The dipper fell on the floor, and Laura crawled under the covers. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes he howled, and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard the voices jabbering again, and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above her face. It was coal black and shiny. His eyes were black and soft. His teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. His face smiled, and a deep voice said, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away, but the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice saying again, "Drink it. It will make you well." So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose. When she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully, and she was not black. She was tanned like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said. The fat woman brought it at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Pa and Ma asleep in the big bed. Jack lay half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the fat woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "There now, you feel better, don't you?" "Yes, thank you," Laura said politely. The fat woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good child," she said. Laura drank every drop of that good broth. "Now go to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything till you're all well." Next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up, but Mrs. Scott said that she must stay in bed until the doctor came. Don't these people ever take pee breaks to the outhouse? Like, why didn't they ever mention outhouses? I guess, but kids needed to know this stuff, right? She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Probably quinine. Laura drank the water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she couldn't swallow the bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him had she not liked him so much. He smiled at her with all his white teeth. He talked with Pa and Ma and laughed a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said that all the settlers up and down the creek had fever and ague. There were not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going from house to house working day and night. "It's a wonder you ever lived through," she said. "All of you down at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them, she didn't know." Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came back to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers and never let anyone come near the house until Pa or Ma told him to, had gone to meet Dr. Tan and begged him to come. And here you all were more dead than alive," Mrs. Scott said. Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came. Now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all the sickness came from eating watermelons. She said, I've said 100 times if I have once that watermelons." "What's that?" Pa exclaimed. "Who's got watermelons?" Mrs. Scott said one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those melons was down sick that very minute. She said she had warned them, but no, she said, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they're paying for it. "I haven't tasted a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup," said Pa. Next day he was out of bed. The next day Laura was up, then Ma got up, then Mary. They were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said that she didn't know how they could ever thank her, and Mrs. Scott said, "Psh, what are neighbors for but to help each other out?" Not anymore. Well, that's the way it seems these days. Pa's cheeks were hollows, and he walked slowly. Ma often sat down to rest, and Laura and Mary didn't feel like playing. Every morning they all took those bitter powders, but Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. "It's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good," he said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair for Ma. He brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms, and he made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire or lift a kettle for Ma. First, he made 4 stout legs and braced them firmly with cross pieces. Then he cut thin strips of the tough willow skin just out under the bark. He wove these strips back and forth under and over until they made a seat for the chair. He split a long straight sapling down the middle. He pegged one end of it to the side of the seat and curved it up and over and down and pegged it over the other side of the seat. That made a high curved back to the chair. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. I think I'm done. And pegged the other end to the other side of the seat. That made a high curved back to the chair. He braced it firmly. Then he wove thin willow strips up and down and under and over each other till they filled in the chair back. With the other half of the split sapling, Pa made arms for the chair. He curved them from the front of the seat to the chair back, and he filled them with woven strips. Okay. Last of all, he split a large willow which had grown in a curve. He turned the chair upside down and he pegged the curves to pieces to its legs to make the rockers, and the chair was done. They made a celebration. Ma took off her apron and smoothed her smooth brown hair. She pinned her gold pin in front of her collar. Mary tied the string of beads around Carrie's neck. Pa and Laura put Mary's pillow on the chair seat and set Laura's pillow against its back. Over the pillows, Pa spread the quilt from the little bed. Then he took Ma's hand and led her to the chair, and he put baby Carrie in her arms. Excuse me, folks. Thank you, darling. I apologize, but it's going to start trickling if I don't get her out. Ma leaned back in the softness. Her thin cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled with tears. But her smile was beautiful. The chair rocked her gently and she said, "Oh, Charles, I haven't been so comfortable since I don't know when." Then Pa took his fiddle and he played and sang to Ma in the firelight. Ma rocked and baby Carrie went to sleep. And Mary and Laura sat on their bench and were happy. The very next day, without saying where he was going, Pa rode away on Patty. He wondered and wondered where he had gone. And when Pa came back, he was balancing a watermelon in front of him on the saddle. He could hardly carry it in the house. He let it fall on the floor and dropped down beside it. "I thought I'd never get it here," he said. "It must weigh 40 pounds. And I'm as weak as water. Hand me the butcher knife." "But Charles," Ma said, "you mustn't," Mrs. Scott said. Pa laughed his big peeling laugh again. "But that's not reasonable." And he was right. You know why? That was much needed liquids and vitamin C that family could have eaten, right? Not to mention the natural sugars that would have boosted their energy levels. "This is a good melon. Why would it have fever and ague?" Ague. Everybody knows that fever and ague comes from breathing the night air. We all know now it comes from mosquitoes. "This watermelon grew in the night air," said Ma. "Nonsense," said Pa. "Give me the butcher knife. I'd eat this melon if I knew it would give me chills and fever." "I do believe you would," said Ma, handing him the knife. It went into the melon with a luscious sound. The green rind split open, and there was the bright red inside flecked with black seeds. The red heart actually looked frosty. Nothing had ever been so tempting as that watermelon on that hot day. Ma would not taste it. She would not let Laura and Mary eat one bite. But Pa ate slice after slice after slice until at last he sighed and said the cow could have the rest of it. Next day, he had a little chill and a little fever, and Ma blamed the watermelon. But next day, she had a chill and a fever. So they did not know what could have caused their fever and ague. No one knew in those days that fever and ague was malaria, and that some mosquitoes give it to people when they bite them. Well, I think also back then, excuse me, you'll see in the later books, in the more books where Laura's an actual coming into an adult and remember stuff, right? Now, yes, it's still this is still all written as fiction, as children's books, but we do have the Pioneer Girl autobiography and another book to get, to fill in the gaps between fiction and reality. But this book is 99% fiction. Any stories that may have been true are stuff she's heard. It's all hearsay, right? From her parents. But can you imagine not letting your children, eat that luscious fruit? Holy crap. I mean, I would have let them have it just for the sake. I wouldn't have made, how can it made absolute no sense to me. So it's amazing they don't get scurvy. But like I said, you'll see later on that they eat with the seasons. They survived mostly, not like Almanzo's family, who always was well stocked because they had like 6 kids and a really prosperous farm. But Pa never stayed in one place long enough to get to a prosperous point until the girls were almost old enough for marriage, or until they were old enough for marriage, pretty much, the 2 older ones. But they would eat like salt pork, bread, cornbread, and dried fruit, and bread, and pancakes, a lot of carbs and fat, and potatoes all winter long. But in the summertime, when they had gardens, they would live lusciously on tomatoes and lettuce and cucumbers and all the things that they could eat fresh, and they would build their system up again for winter. Does that make sense? We live in a society today that we can get fresh produce. Well, who knows now with the way things are going, right? But we have been able to get fresh produce all year round, from all over the world. Maybe that's been a problem. Maybe that's been a problem with our diets, right? So we eat in the wintertime, we eat a lot of things like meatloaf and pasta and roasts with lots of carrots and potatoes and rutabagas. And in the summertime, we eat a lot of salads and fresh tomatoes and fresh vegetables and stuff, right? Thank you. All right. Thank you for joining me on Little House Live, day 31, and we'll see you next Saturday for 2 more chapters, Fire in the Chimney and Pa Goes to Town. All right. We'll see you then, and thanks for joining me. Take care. God bless.